Good. So this is joint work with Ilan, who's in the audience, and with my PhD student, Kamessi. And it's about the future of ride-hailing, hopefully, in which we see autonomous vehicles.
If you click on it once.
All right. So the premise of this talk is that autonomous vehicles are indeed coming, that we don't need to worry about the technology because all of us are here at EC because we're not at a control conference where we actually try to engineer real systems. So to some extent, I want to take as given that the technology is going to work. And for those of you who were at Informs last year in Phoenix, you may have actually experienced that the technology works. If I wasn't showing a PDF, all of these things would be moving and you could see the steering wheel move itself. The cars are driving themselves. Again, the premise of this talk is that the technology from an engineering perspective works, which begs the question of how are they actually going to be deployed on platforms? Now, there are various ways in which the deployment could play out. And I want to emphasize that some of these ways are very much in flux. So you never used this here, but I love it. So you that Cruise is crossed out over here. The reason is that Cruise was operating an AV-only platform in San Francisco for some time. Then it turned out that the technology wasn't working so well. There was one fatality, and now they are no longer operating in San Francisco. But Waymo is still operating in San Francisco as an AV-only platform. What I mean by that is there's a platform, there's an app, Waymo One. You can request a ride to it, and you won't be matched to a human driver because Waymo has only autonomous vehicles on it. At the same time, if you go to Phoenix, you can use your Uber app and you can get a Waymo ride through the Uber app. To be clear, you don't request a Waymo ride, you just request a ride, and then Waymo decides whether to send you an autonomous vehicle or to send you a human driver, an independent contractor. So we have these different types of deployment options, and even within these different types, we will see that there are a bunch of different versions in which this could play out. So first of all, I want to sort of motivate the idea of having a hybrid fleet with both autonomous vehicles and contractors. So on the one hand, you might think, well, why would I possibly want human drivers on my platform if I can have autonomous vehicles? Well, if you look at this plot here, okay, I shouldn't be using this technology. I don't know how it works. If you look at this plot here, it shows you demand in New York City, average demand in New York City by hour of the week. And in particular, you can see that it's very variable and there are clear seasonalities across different hours. Now, if you want to only operate with autonomous vehicles, then you're going to run into a problem where meeting the peak demand might not be worth it because autonomous vehicles are expensive. The New York Times recently estimated that an autonomous vehicle costs $150,000 to $200,000 to build. That is a lot more than like a $20,000 Toyota Prius that a human driver can drive. So in order for it to pay off, to have an autonomous vehicle, that autonomous vehicle should really be highly utilized. Else, it's cheaper to just have a human drive for 6 hours a week or 8 hours a week. And that creates some tension. And at that tension, we want to understand in this work whether humans and autonomous vehicles should work together as two different supply sources on a platform. Now, how can this deployment work? There are two options we currently see. One is the AV-only platform, which is going to be inefficient sometimes due to the inflexible capacity. You have a fixed number of autonomous vehicles, but demand, as you've just seen, is very variable over the course of a week. You can have what we see in Phoenix, which is autonomous vehicles deployed on an open platform, which is Uber just decides in real time do I serve this particular right through a human or through a contractor or through an AV? You can also imagine other versions. You can imagine Waymo building a fleet of autonomous vehicles, putting it into a city, and then Uber saying every week, or maybe every afternoon, this is how many vehicles I would like to lease from you for the next week, for the next month, for the next afternoon. So there are various versions in which this could work. There's also what I would call the Waymo buys Lyft option, which is Waymo buys a platform like Lyft, and it is definitely not the Lyft buys Waymo option, by the way, because that is just not attainable for Lyft. The Waymo buys Lyft option, in which the platform that is operating the AVs is the same platform that has built and owns the autonomous vehicles. And that will be our benchmark. I want to highlight that both the leasing option and the integrated option are not observed anywhere in practice today, but they are conceivable. Now, the first piece I want to highlight, and maybe the most interesting piece here, is that there's a risk of AV underutilization, of AVs not being utilized as highly as they would expect in an open platform, and that can lead to an inefficiency. What do I mean by that? Well, I need to specify some sort of a model, and I try not to be too formal about it, but I'll try to give a flavor of the model. We have an open platform. Think of that as being Lyft. And we have both human drivers and AVs. AVs are being provided by Waymo at large capital expenditure, but with a very low marginal cost. That's the very premise of autonomous vehicles. They don't need the driver. Contractors, on the other hand, drive a cheap Toyota Prius, so the fixed cost is very small, but they need to spend their time, so the marginal cost is high. Now, the platform gets ride requests and needs to decide for every request whether to send an autonomous vehicle or to send a contractor. That decision is what we call dispatch prioritization. Which supply type to use for any given demand. Now, here's what we mean by AV underutilization, and here's really sort of the main driver of our results. What you would think, given everything that I've said, is that you would want to use AVs to cover the low demand, the base demand, and then whenever demand is high, that's when you want to use contractors. So imagine now you have the following numbers. You have 20 AVs, and they are very cheap to operate for $1. And you have contractors that are willing to show up if they're going to earn $15 in expectation. And our demand is either 20 or 30. And our revenue per demand is very high. I don't want to specify very high, but it's very high. At that point, what you could do is you could say, well, I'm going to pay contractors $30 per hour and only use them in the high demand set. But it turns out that it's cheaper to pay contractors $15 an hour and use them both in the low and the high demand state. Because if you were to just pay them $30 per hour, you end up also incurring the marginal cost of the AVs. You end up paying more, even though the marginal cost is so small. So what you end up with in this scenario is that even though AVs are cheaper, they end up idling some of the time. And the problem with this is that if you're now not the platform, but you're the supplier, and you're thinking about how many vehicles do I want to put on the platform, well, you don't want to put AVs on the platform that are then not highly utilized, because AVs have a high fixed cost that you're going to incur. So that is really where our results are sort of starting to capture something that seems fundamentally problematic in terms of a misalignment between platform and supplier. Now, when we first presented this to an AV company, they responded with, we're not really worried about this. We're really just thinking right now about the technology. And once we have the technology, it's going to print money by itself. And then half a year later, there was this headline in the news in which Uber CEO said that he foresees a future in which 20% of the drivers will be autonomous vehicles. And at that point, the people I knew at the AV company reached back out and said, actually, now we're a bit concerned. We thought we would be 80% of the drivers. They are telling us we're just going to be 20% of the drivers. Why won't our AVs be more highly utilized? This is a concern. So, to give you some overview of where our contribution now fits in, we have a bunch of work that exists at this point on AV operations, including by our session chair and Garrett. We have, of course, a lot of work on platform operations more generally. What our work does is that it connects these ideas to supply chain management, and in particular, to the question of how to align a supplier, in our case, a supplier of autonomous vehicles, with a platform, that being the platform that eventually operates the system. Now, to specify our model a bit more formally, though not fully formally, we assume that there's, it can be a platform, it could also be a social planner that sets a price. Think of that, if you're familiar with the supply chain literature, think of that as a wholesale price per ride. So sets a price long-term in advance, saying to the supplier, for every ride that I will serve through your AVs, here's how much I will pay you. And this happens long in advance. Then the supplier, this is Waymo, makes an investment decision of how many vehicles do I want to put on the platform. And for each vehicle, they will incur a fixed cost. Then what we call a scenario realizes. Think of a scenario as a Friday evening that is sunny with a Taylor Swift concert. That is one scenario. Another scenario would be a Friday morning that is rainy and nothing else is going on. Given this scenario, the platform decides how to serve demand through both contractors and AVs. And this you can think of as a reasonably short-term decision. In equilibrium with the short-term decision based on the scenario, contractors choose whether or not to show up on the platform. And then in real time, demand realizes and gets fulfilled based on the dispatch priority that was committed to for the scenario. Okay, I thought that was a question. You can formalize this in this way, but I will skip the formalization. And the idea of what then happens is that we can write this as a game with the subgame perfect equilibrium, where subgame perfect equilibrium means that at each stage, each player, the platform or the supplier, makes a decision that is optimal given the expectation of what the other party will do downstream. Now, we compare this with an integrated platform where the supplier and the platform have the same interest, they share the same profit function. And we want to understand the profit ratio between those two. In EC terms, we could call it the price of anarchy. And what we want to understand is, one, how large is this profit ratio? And second, is there a contract that the platform and the supplier could sign in order to ensure that it is not as large, in order to ensure that the efficiency loss here is not too large? What do we find? The first result is that the equilibrium, the subgame perfect equilibrium, can be arbitrarily worse compared to a centralized solution. And the reason for that, in a sense, is weirdly, and I don't have time to go into the detail, it's weirdly the high demand scenario. So when demand is high, then the platform really wants contractors to come onto the platform. So the platform will prioritize contractors. But if the platform prioritizes contractors, that means that AVs will have lower utilization. And we can show that there exist scenarios where this leads the platform to then not provide any vehicles the supplier to not provide any vehicles to the platform. Now, can we fix it? We have this inefficiency. Are we able to do something about it? The answer is yes, but the details depend a little bit. If the platform can commit for every scenario to an exact utilization, then we can make the inefficiency completely go away. So that would effectively mean that the platform commits on a Friday night with a Taylor Swift concert. I'm going to serve this much demand through AVs. On a Friday morning where it's sunny, I'm going to serve this much demand through AVs. That seems hard to imagine that such a contract can be legally written up. However, if you don't have such a contract, it is in general impossible to align the supply chain just by specifying the utilization in the future. At the same time, what we show is you could have a contract that says, in any given situation, I will fully prioritize autonomous vehicles. That's not optimal. There are situations, right? Like on a Friday evening with a Taylor Swift concert, you want a lot of humans to show up. In that case, you would want to prioritize human drivers. But if you commit to not doing so, you don't get an optimum. But we can show that if you sign such a contract, then either what you get under that contract or the equilibrium, the sub-perfect equilibrium in the absence of a contract gets you within a factor of 2 of what the benchmark would give you. We can robustify that by adding a lot of different parts to this model. We can create an outside option for the AVs if they are not used by the platform. We can add dynamic pricing and dynamic wages for contractors. Qualitatively, everything remains the same. And what we can also do is we can compare this with other models of deployment. So for example, the leasing option or the integrated option. And in short, what we find is that the open platform with the contract is more efficient in worst case instances. Worst case instances, that's Hamilton ratio, than the other options. We've evaluated this using New York City demand data. And what we find is that the pathological instances that we construct to show the worst case unbounded results don't occur in practice, as one would expect. But we do find profit ratios in the range of 10% or 30% loss, except for when we use our contracting solution. In that scenario, the loss drops from 10 or 30% to 0.4%. So effectively in practice, I don't want to say in practice, in the data, we see that it effectively aligns the supply chain. So what do we see in total? We have this issue of AV underutilization, which is a bit unintuitive in that in high demand scenarios, the platform would want to utilize AVs less. And in order to deal with that, and what that leads to is that the supplier then wants to provide fewer AVs to the platform. In order to deal with that, we show that contracting solutions are needed. We show that some such contracting solutions would work well. But more broadly, I think what this shows is that as we're thinking about the future of autonomous technologies being deployed in practical systems, there are interesting operational questions for us, even in our communities to answer, even if we're not developing the autonomous vehicles ourselves. Thank you.
I still want to ask about the intuition of underutilization. So Let me think about this. If the company has 100 AVs and then there's Taylor Swift concert going on, like it seems the motivation entirely comes from reservation earnings threshold of independent contractors. But however, if we assume that ICs, like independent contractors, the supply and the demand fluctuates based on the market, you just set a high price, like that will naturally they'll have a high supply. So you always prioritize the first 100 AVs and then you set a price in advance to the supply to fluctuate. For
the part that's missing, and I may have glossed over it, after the scenario realizes Friday night Taylor Swift, there's still randomness in the demand. So the scenario realizes Friday night Taylor Swift, there's going to be a lot of demand, but we don't know how many requests exactly. So we're going to have a parking lot outside the Taylor Swift concert with 100 AVs and 500 human drivers. And if we have 600 requests, then we're fine, because then everybody will be utilized. But if we have 550 requests, then 50 vehicles will be not utilized. And those 50 vehicles could be 25 AVs, 25 humans, or it could be 50 AVs, 0 humans, or anything else. Does that make sense?
But could you adjust the price to the independent contractor? Do they just automatically leave if they're more?
What we show is that the pricing does not resolve. In fact, the platform having downstream flexibility to change prices can make the misalignment even worse.
So so you're assuming the independent contractors commit to participating before the scenario is realized?
No, after the scenario realizes, but before the actual demand realizes. So they commit to participate on the night of the Taylor Swift concert, but they don't know how many.
So there's no equalizing of demand and supply within that second stage of variation.
No.
And then the second thing I was going to ask is, do you have density effects at all in this model or not?
And what we do have is, do I have it after? No. What we do have is numerical results that show that the prioritization does not, in most cases, significantly get affected by the density effect. And the reason for that is actually somewhat intuitive. If you think about very high demand, it's easy to utilize everybody. If you think about the system where there's imbalance and that supply is high relative to demand, in that scenario, you would want to actively prioritize. But in that scenario, you have so many AVs that it's cheap to prioritize. Yes.
So in the model with contracting, what are you doing with the independent contractor? So let's say again, Taylor Swift, you promised the AV 100 rights, right? So what are you going to do with your humans?
So if I promise full prioritization to the AVs, I'm going to have, if 500 contractors show up and demand is 550, I'm going to not use those remaining contractors, but I have an equilibrium constraint that ensures that either I need to pay the contractors enough to show up or they just won't show up.
So just to kind of drill down this one a little bit. So the idea is that contractors have some wage that you need to pay them. I think you're not distinguishing necessarily between idle costs and driving costs, but that I think makes sense if the AV mile driving depreciates the AV, which is very expensive. Is that good intuition?
So think of it as for the contractors, I have a constraint that looks like this. In every scenario, the number of contractors that show up times their reservation wage, that is the total amount that they need to earn in the scenario in order for them to want to show up. That has to be equal to the wage that I pay them multiplied by the expected demand that they fulfill.